The Federal Reserve just launched its central bank digital currency pilot program. In other words, FedCoin is officially live. The dystopian nightmare, unfortunately, has begun. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. And make sure you stay to the end of this video because I'm going to show you how you can push back against FedCoin, the authoritarians, and the central planners to make sure they're not stealing your freedom. All right, let's get right into the whiteboard. Step number 1, let's go over how the current system works. And the reason I'm going to focus on the current system is because at the beginning of this pilot program, the Fed is launching for a central bank digital currency, or for FedCoin, starts with distributed ledger technology. To hear them explain it in their own words, let's go right to the New York Fed's website. Editor, let's cut to the internet. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York today announced that its New York Innovation Center, which is basically just a branch or department of the New York Fed, will participate in a proof of concept project to explore the feasibility of an interoperable network of central bank wholesale digital money, i.e. CBDC, and commercial bank digital money operating on a shared multi-entity distributed ledger. In other words, this whole pilot program is about them testing this new distributed ledger, or at least this is what they want you to believe. So currently, the way this system works, this network that already has multiple ledgers, and you're going to see that in just a moment, is pretty basic, pretty straightforward. We're going to start this example with the average Mike. And he is going to transfer $100 to his good buddy, the average Joe. Just a normal transaction, just like you do daily. So in order to transfer this money, and maybe he writes a check, maybe he does a wire, maybe he goes on Zelle, something like that, he's going to initiate this transaction with his bank. So let's just say Mike banks with ABC Bank. And he says, ABC Bank, I need you to send my good buddy, the average Joe, $100. So let's also assume that Joe banks with XYZ Bank. And in the middle, we have everyone's favorite entity that is implementing a central bank digital currency pilot program, the Federal Reserve. So what happens behind the scenes here? Well, ABC sends a message to the clearinghouse. Now, we'll just use the 2 main ones right now. That's going to be FedWire and CHIPS. So CHIPS is Clearing House Interbank Payment System. This is one of the main clearing houses used. And we're going to get into some specific numbers as to how many transactions they process daily. And trust me, it's going to completely blow your mind. But the bottom line is the message is sent to one of these clearing houses, and they settle on the Fed's balance sheet. FedWire in real time, CHIPS nets everything out and then settles at the end of the day. And keep in mind that both ABC and XYZ have an account with the Fed. That would be a liability on the Fed's balance sheet. And you can see right here, represented by this square, I've got the account for ABC, and then I've got the account for XYZ. In other words, the sending bank and the receiving bank. I'd also like to point out that banks don't necessarily have to settle with their account at the Federal Reserve. ABC Bank would most likely have an account with XYZ, and XYZ would most likely have an account with ABC. But just to keep this example simple, we're just going to assume that this $100 transaction is in fact settled on the Fed's balance sheet. So let's go through the balance sheet of each entity involved and see this transaction from start to finish. And it'll be very easy for you to understand how this current system works. So ABC Bank, assets on the left, liabilities on the right. And we'll assume that they've just got this one deposit from average Mike for $100. Let's just assume they have $100 in bank reserves to offset this liability. And keep in mind, these are bank reserves denominated in dollars, an asset of the commercial bank, but a liability of the Federal Reserve. So moving over to XYZ Bank, we'll just assume that Joe has no money. He is completely broke. And we'll assume that he is their only customer. So they have no liabilities and no assets. All right, so the Fed's balance sheet has the account of ABC and XYZ, like we said earlier. And in the ABC account, they've got this $100 in bank reserves. XYZ has $0. So after this transaction finishes, at the conclusion, we'll go ahead and look at their balance sheets and how they would differ from the beginning. So now ABC would have 0 assets, 0 liabilities. The Fed would still have $100 in liabilities, but the $100 would be transferred from ABC to XYZ. And then XYZ on their balance sheet, they would have the $100 in bank reserves that ABC started with, but they'd also have the $100 liability because that deposit that Mike had for $100 was a liability of ABC. They basically transferred that liability over to XYZ. So again, XYZ Bank now has that $100 liability or deposit for average Joe, and they've got the $100 in bank reserves that ABC started with. So these two balance sheets have changed significantly, but the Fed's balance sheet remains the exact same. Let's just assume for a moment that you took each step of this transaction along with the parties involved and wrote that down on a piece of paper. What would you have? You'd have a good old-fashioned ledger. That's right, a technology that isn't that advanced. And it's the technology that the current system uses. It's just like all of you watching this video right now when you check your account online and you see all of those transactions going out and coming in, or you actually have your paper bank statement. All that is your section of the ledger system. And I'd like to ask you a quick question. In your experience, how often has this system failed? How often do you get a bank statement or check your account online where there's a transaction that is inaccurate? Now, I'm not saying fraud. I'm not saying when someone steals your card or accidentally runs it for something that you didn't buy. I'm saying where there's an actual mistake, that a transaction that is showing on your bank statement didn't occur at all. My guess is that happens very, very rarely, if at all. Okay, George, what are you getting at? My point here is the current system that they have is centralized, but it is very, very efficient. So this would beg the question, why are they changing it? And you may be saying to yourself, oh, George, you just don't get it. Their current system isn't a distributed ledger system. Therefore, it's vastly inferior. Okay, but my pushback would be, it is definitely a ledger system, and ABC has the record, along with the Fed and XYZ, of the transaction. And I would also add that whatever clearinghouse they used, or whatever system, is going to have a record of the transaction as well. So I know this isn't exactly a distributed ledger system, but it is a ledger system that has some distribution. And I would also say, how often does this system fail? Very, very rarely. So this brings us to our next talking point, which is the daily volume that this system processes. Editor, let's cut right to the internet. Over 1 million transactions are processed every single day, with a sum total of $4.5 trillion. Just to reiterate, that is every single day of the week, Monday through Friday. So again, it begs the question, if this system already works extremely well, very few mistakes, and it's very efficient, then why are they changing? The answer to this question is what your freedom and liberty depends on. And we're going to be exploring this throughout the rest of this video. Step number 2. Now let's go over the new system the Federal Reserve is testing with their central bank digital currency pilot program. And I want to make sure you're sitting down for this one because you've definitely got to put your thinking cap on. This one is mentally, intellectually, incredibly vigorous. Are you ready? Okay. This is the old system, very antiquated and outdated. It might as well be straight from the 1700s. This is the one that we went over in step number 1, where ABC transfers $100 to XYZ Bank in the name of Mike, transferring money to Joe, going through the settlement system, and then settling on the Fed's balance sheet. You all understand how that works, but here is where it gets very, very complicated. You see, we move from this old, antiquated system to the modern world with the new distributed ledger technology, or DLT as the kids are calling it today. So what would happen in this modern technology is ABC Bank would actually have a record of ABC transferring $100 to XYZ. And the Federal Reserve would have the exact same record or the same ledger. And believe it or not, XYZ would have the exact same thing. You see, all the parties involved in the transaction would have a record of that transaction. Now you're probably saying to yourself, wait a minute, George. And you've probably got that look on your face, like that meme with the guy from Step Brothers. Editor, make sure you throw that up. And you're saying to yourself, this new technology pretty much does the exact same thing as this old technology. Exactly. This is the point I'm trying to illustrate. You see, the benefit of DLT, or distributed ledger technology, is that it's decentralized. So one of the main benefits that you receive from this decentralization is the fact that it's completely transparent. So if Mike or Joe wanted to see what was happening with this very opaque system, they could do so easily. If Mike wanted to check out the transactions that ABC is doing, all the derivative contracts, let's say, or what their balance sheet truly looks like, he would have access to this. But if you have this type of DLT, or distributed ledger system, that is closed and only accessible by the banksters and the Fed themselves, it's no different than the current system. Which takes us straight back to the question we asked in step number 1. If these two ways of settling a transaction have some differences maybe, but they're almost identical, and if the net result is the exact same, then why are they changing? The answer is this is not about DLT. This is about programmable money and having total control over you and your family. Step number 3, programmable money. This is the Fed's end game, and this is what this CBDC pilot program is all about. Most people realize that this move towards Fed coin, if you will, is an attack on personal freedom and liberty. From the standpoint of the government, the central planners and the authoritarians will have access to every single transaction you make. This is straight out of Orwell's 1984. But what they don't realize is their account that they have at Bank America or Wells Fargo will most likely become a liability of the Federal Reserve. So check this out. The Fed is right here at the top, and I'd like you to notice their balance sheet. Assets on the left, liabilities on the right, and they have the account, the reserve account for ABC Bank and XYZ, but now they have the account for the average Mike and the average Joe. And this is crucially important. You understand this dynamic. Now, it is true that in the future, or when this CBDC thing plays out, the banks could still hold your deposits as their liabilities. But I think those deposits, or at least the loans they make, will be backed up by the Federal Reserve. So as an example, XYZ Bank gives you a mortgage for $500,000. Then the Fed would immediately buy that mortgage so that debt would exist on the Fed's balance sheet. This is crucial because the Fed's balance sheet is infinite. And what this can lead to is lending not based on merit or your ability to pay back the loan, but lending an extension of credit and how much you're paying for the debt based on a political narrative. More on that in just a moment. So now I know a lot of the pushback that you get on Twitter or maybe with your friends and family members is, oh, the banks will never ever agree to this because this takes away their deposits. This takes away their ability to lend. In other words, it takes away one of their revenue streams. First of all, I don't think the banks would lose much money if we went to a Fed coin. Why? Because right now, they're pretty much making fees on transactions. They don't hold much of the consumer debt on their balance sheet. So going back to that example of you getting a $500,000 mortgage from Wells Fargo, before the ink's dry, they've taken that debt and sold it to Fannie and Freddie. So it's off their balance sheet. And then Fannie and Freddie takes those mortgages and turns them into mortgage-backed sausages, as I call them, and just pawns them off on Wall Street. So again, the fee is made by the initiation of the mortgage. They're almost like a mortgage broker from that standpoint. But let's just assume for a moment that your dollars that you have in your bank account right now go from being a liability of your local bank to a liability of the Federal Reserve. And let's just assume that this does impact their bottom line. Who actually owns the Federal Reserve? It's the banksters themselves. So if the Fed is making the profit or the banksters are making the profit, it still goes in the same entity's back pocket at the end of the day. And to show you just how incestuous this actually is, let's go back to step number one. Remember the clearinghouse, CHIPS, clearinghouse interbank payment system. Well, who do you think owns CHIPS? It would be the banksters themselves. Now let's get into some details so you can really get your head around how this works, and more importantly, understand how you can push back against the authoritarians and central planners, how you can maintain the freedom and liberty you value. So what is different about this new system is not the fact that it's a distributed ledger. That's very similar to the old way of doing business. But it's really about the payment rails and the software being used. As an example, you can imagine if they're all using Excel right now to keep track of this ledger system. Well, now you add programmable money. Well, that Excel program isn't accustomed or isn't set up to handle those types of transactions. So what am I referring to specifically? Okay, well, this is where we get into the attack on your freedom. So let's go back to the average Mike. Well, the Fed is going to know exactly what he is spending his money on. And we can see in the mainstream media that there's more and more talk about measuring your monthly carbon score. In fact, the World Economic Forum, our buddy Klaus Schwab, has backed and supported credit cards that tell you what your monthly carbon footprint has been. In other words, how much you consume, what your impact on the environment has been for the entire month. Well, when we have a central bank digital currency, what they can easily do, since they have programmable money, is they can cut you off from spending on certain items, or they can cut you off from spending altogether. Let's just assume for a moment that Mike likes to eat a steak every once in a while. Well, let's say that we're 23 days into the month, and the Fed, the central planners, and the authoritarians can see that Mike has exceeded his carbon allocation for meat consumption. So what they can do is they can just turn off the dollars that he has in his account at the Fed. They turn off his ability to use his hard-earned dollars to buy beef, so now he can only use his dollars to buy something that's far more friendly to the environment. Everybody's favorite dinner protein, bugs. But unfortunately, that's not where the 1984 Orwellian dystopia ends. Let's move over to the average Joe. Obviously, he is very, very upset. Why? Because he just went in to get a mortgage and he saw that his interest rate is 10% compared to the lowest interest rate available, let's say at 1%. And you say, George, well, why on earth does he have such a high interest rate? Does he have a bad credit score? Oh, no, no, no. It's because the average Joe is a straight white guy. Well, who gets the 1% interest rate? Oh, well, that would be the American Indian trans chick who identifies as a furry. Now you may be saying to yourself, okay, George, well, you've taken it too far. That's ridiculous. That's never going to happen. Really? Editor, let's go straight to my Twitter feed, and you can see that the Federal Reserve themselves just proudly tweeted out the fact that the Central Bank of Canada is hosting a conference on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what this means is the central banks themselves who issue this central bank digital currency will be able to control who gets credit and who doesn't, and at what price. And it won't be based on merit, it'll be based on political narrative. In other words, they are going woke, and if you value freedom and liberty, they're going to try to make you go broke. So what's the solution? How do you push back against this dystopia that the central planners and authoritarians are trying to push us towards? It's actually very simple. See, in order to implement this entire plan, in order to give this programmable money teeth, to make it stick so that they can usurp all the power and control they lust for, they have to do one thing first. They have to ban cash. Because that cash gives you a way to transact outside of their stupid, draconian, Orwellian, dystopian system. As long as those green pieces of paper are still legal tender, it gives you the ability to continue to buy beef instead of being forced to buy bugs. And I know it sounds funny, but it is absolutely the truth. Cash, cold, hard currency, is the only thing that stands between your freedom and the authoritarians and central planners. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.